Jeremy Adelman. Jeremy is professor and director of the Global History Lab at the University of Cambridge. He's a historian. I will leave the floor to my dear Jeremy. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sadi. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and to be meeting with so many new wonderful colleagues. I'm going to do a screen share. So I'm actually going to be talking about a actually quite a new research project, which I'm hoping to spend the next few weeks really embedding myself in and getting my thoughts straightened out. I've just finished a book called Depending on Strangers, Love, Fear, and the Making of the Modern World, which is a very big, encompassing story about the making of global interdependence. And a few years ago, I stepped into some archives because as a historian, I missed doing archival work about El Salvador. And so I'm going to start there and then pull back and raise questions about civil wars and world orders. So please excuse the difficult imagery. On March 24th, 1980, a sharpshooter assassinated Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador with a single .22 caliber bullet that had been shot at the Archbishop while he was giving mass in San Salvador. The shooter was part of a Catholic far-right anti-communist hit squad. He was the lieutenant in the fiery, God-fearing movement led by Major Roberto del Buisson. Some of you might remember this character, who was the founder of the far-right movement called Arena, who would later die of cancer of the esophagus weeks after the peace accords were finally signed in 1992. This photograph, incidentally, is taken by Eulalio Perez Garcia of the Diario de Hoy. This assassination was a turning point in the making of the civil war in El Salvador. Now, for the previous year, Archbishop Romero had been receiving death threats, letters warning that he was going to be assassinated, and his own correspondences and Sunday sermons, which have been broadcast to thousands of people by radio, made it increasingly clear that Romero himself saw that his days were numbered and was aware that there was a brewing civil war going on within the Catholic Church itself. Note, in fact, that middle letter right here, down here. It's a little hard with the resolution. It's signed La Phalange. And we'll come back to the Phalange in a bit when we talk about Lebanon. To make matters worse, 1 week after his assassination, the funeral was held in front of the National Cathedral in San Salvador. And as mourners gathered in front of the cathedral, an explosion went off on one side of the square, which led to a panic. And here's the photographic representation. Snipers who were up on the roofs in the buildings around the National Square opened fire. And in the trampling and the panic, some 30, it's still very hard to tell, 30 people were left dead. It was made more complicated by the fact that there were parking barriers throughout the central square because it was also doubled as a parking lot. And in the scramble, so many people died. Note in the image here the number of shoes that were left behind as people tried to evacuate the central square. Romero's body then had to be taken down into the bottom of the cathedral and quickly put into a crypt while an Irish priest recited prayers. So this week of the last week of March 1980 was what I will call the incitement to 12 years of war in El Salvador. The first and the increasingly irreversible step from repression to civil war. For Romero was the symbol of the possibility of peace and democracy in El Salvador, and his death shattered the first and crippled the second. So while I'm here at the Institute, I'm working on this part of a bigger puzzle about how civil wars shape the world war, shape world history, notably in the decades from the 1970s to the 1990s, bringing about the eclipse of third world utopias, the waning of the Cold War, and early globalization. And it gave rise to new practices and discourses of human security and state security, and the emergence of that magical word, terror, from the edges of the deconstruction of the post-1945 world order. So this is where I started working on El Salvador, is to be a case study. And of course, when I began to read the secondary literature and some of the theoretical work on civil wars, big questions began to emerge. And so sadly, I'm in the middle of exploring these big questions. What role does political violence play within states in making world orders? What role did the shifting world orders then play in opening internal bloody divides within societies? And so I'm looking at three case studies in particular, El Salvador, Lebanon, and Sri Lanka, as for now, case studies of this process, which offer us a view on world making from the edges. What do the margins, like these small countries, tell us about the functioning of the whole system? Not edges, not as exceptions to a general rule, but as extremes. Stories about extreme dependency, and so salience on external forces, which we'll talk about shortly, and of course, extreme violence that reshaped the wider order. There's a challenge studying civil wars. They're often highly particularized, often as unique breakdowns and anarchies, or they're essentialized as what are often used as blood feuds. And that's, in fact, the favored narrative of civil war. In fact, there were logics, and they were not just accidental, and they had patterns. And they also clustered in particular historic conjunctures. We do have to apply some social science techniques, though I'm a storyteller and a historian. I think we can borrow from other disciplines. And I'm going to run through some data very quickly. A story, in a sense, of four graphs. The first is a measure of the total number of new wars and types of new wars from 1946 to 2011. This is based on data, the Uppsala war measurement. We can maybe talk about data collection on wars. You'll notice here that there's a spike in civil wars after 1975 and then again early in the 1990s, and international wars become rarer. What about casualties? So if this is the number of wars, what about the casualty? Well, let's look at the data from a team that published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution that targeted what are called targeted mass killings to capture the intensity of the lethality of these kinds of wars. So here you see targeted mass killings of genocide and politicized, again, from roughly the same period. Once more, an inflection that comes in the mid-1970s, Cambodia, Lebanon, El Salvador, Sri Lanka, spiking in 1983, a sharp decline at the end of the Cold War in 1989, then a leaping again in the early 90s with Rwanda and Yugoslavia. Now, some may legitimately object that targeted mass killings presumes civil war. They don't map perfectly onto each other. In fact, you often get one-sided targeted. Rwanda is the classic case of that. It's not a civil war. It was just a sheer mass-targeted atrocity. The balance, sorry that the graph is showing up a little strangely here. These are different forms of state-based conflict by the type of conflict. International versus national largely is the category that we're concerned with. And you'll see that warfare becomes increasingly lethal, more countries, and a tilt from international wars to civil wars. Last graph, again, back to the Uppsala death data trends, you'll see the big jump occurring in two junctures. One is around Nigeria and Bangladesh from 68 to 71. And then once again, and this is the moment that we will be talking about, which is the 1980s, that upsurge from the mid-70s to 1991. There are a number of puzzles within puzzles here. There's a problem of naming and categorizing what's foreign and what's domestic. Walter Lippmann once famously said that in an interdependent world, all wars are civil wars. But civil wars are very particular types of wars. They're between neighbors and between cousins, often sometimes called cousins' wars. And they're especially brutal because they're fratricidal. One analyst has preferred to use the concept of wars between peoples. This is something we can talk about, how to label these forms of conflicts in the Q&A. Furthermore, the organization of violence in civil wars varies tremendously. I'm going to run through our 3 case studies very quickly so you'll get a sense. In El Salvador, here was clearly a struggle between an organized and highly trained guerrilla insurgency against a US-backed national army. Sri Lanka was very different. Sri Lanka was a hybrid of a guerrilla war like El Salvador, with acts of civilian terrorism, and this is why the word terror, it looms large in the story, the emergence of the use of this word and concept. For instance, assassinations, in this case, bombings in the streets, the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, and bombing civilian aircrafts by the Tamil Tigers. I'll talk about them shortly. In their insurgency against the national army that was increasingly trained by the research and analysis wing of the Indian Army, with the United Kingdom and Israeli forces playing lesser roles in providing counter-insurgent intelligence and training. And then there's Lebanon. Here is the complete collapse of the national army and the mobilization of a multi-sided war between militias and the Fatah. I'll talk about them shortly, which was the Fatah in many ways was the most formally trained armed force on the ground, thanks largely to Muammar Gaddafi. And you can see in this photograph the portrait of Gaddafi on the grill of this truck. The photograph, incidentally, taken by a great Lebanese photojournalist named Claude Salhani. The portrait of Gaddafi serving, in a sense, as target practice for the militiamen. In all of these cases, there are wars within wars, civil wars within Cold Wars, and Cold War forces embedded and regional contestation embedded within civil wars. So I have 4 guiding questions for the project, and I will write in response to one of them. We'll talk about them. One is, how do civil wars start? Few conflicts and atrocities actually cause prolonged war. Most rebellions or repression they often stall out, they don't lead to civil war. Secondly, how do civil wars become intractable? And I'm especially interested in the conjunction of the form of warfare, particularly forms of insurgency, and the connection to economic resources that makes this kind of warfare sustainable and hard to ratchet back. Third, how do they end? Especially when both sides learn to loathe each other. So how to bring it in. In fact, I prefer the term that Guillaume Piketty, a wonderful French historian, uses as sortir de la guerre. It's not ending a war, it's leaving a war, because war and peace, there isn't a sharp dividing line between the two of them, as Javier will know, is in the case of Colombia. All of these cases, with Sri Lanka being the exception, were mediated endings of war. And so a question arises of when wars don't end with victories of one side, what kind of peace do you get? And the final question is, how do civil wars make world orders? And that's what I'm going to talk about now. Starting with the first question. As we think about how conflicts from 1975 to 1990 shaped global norms and institutions, particularly around global governance emerges before the end of the Cold War. It doesn't wait till 1989 to come into being. And how international humanitarian law and governance, in response to atrocities and warfare and human security, we begin to see elements of global, what we would now call global governance, emerging, but also the edges, from these edges, the beginnings of a different kind of war on terror on its march to becoming more global. Let's return to Archbishop Romero, just to close things out, to the incitement moment, that first question: how do they start? This is, of course, a subject of enormous discussion nowadays, especially in the United States, for obvious reasons. How do neighbors go to war with each other in a conflict that leaves all sides worse off? And what escalates conflicts to civil war? There are general theories. Small countries like these, the edges, what's called the Bakunin problem, attract major powers who turn these edges into proxy wars. Some people explain things in terms of social polarization. That's one. It's a second theory. There's a third, which is about failed transitions to or from democracies. What happens is that breakdowns occur when transitions create opportunities for new winners and losers, but governments are too weak or illegitimate to manage the contest between winners and losers. And in this breakdown, so these are all variations of a chapter in the larger story about civil wars, about the breakdown portion of the narrative. Within that, there is an inciting moment, beyond which the war is irreversible. And so these inciting incidents, I'm going to talk about 3 of them, how they're framed and told as incitements. And there are 4 steps to them. I'm going to whip through very quickly: brutalization, vengeance, impunity, and finally, the fracturing of the geographical space of each one of the states. Sri Lanka. Oh, here, I gave you a gratuitous image. Sorry, I should have slipped this in. This is the kind of fighting force that we saw at work in Lebanon. Sri Lanka, very quickly. Here is a story of the breakdown of a pact that had been created in 1946 of a balance of power between Sinhalese majority and the Tamil minority, which by the 1960s was breaking down. The inciting incident for war, though, was Black July of 1983. This was an anti-Taliban pogrom prompted by an ambush by a group of Tamil Tiger, which left 13 Sri Lankan soldiers dead. In a very choreographed public wake that carried these 13 soldiers to the capital of Colombo, the Sinhalese majority population was inflamed to lead to attacks and brutal reprisals against Tamil citizens, including the murder of almost 300 inmates in a prison of Wellikada. And the president of Sri Lanka was explicitly indifferent about the suffering of Tamil civilians. It was this that escalated and led to the leader of the Tamil Tigers. You can see the leader who's seated in the middle, to focus on this Black July as the turning point, the point of no return, the Rubicon for the Civil War, which would only finally end with his death in May of 2009. This is a famous image of his body being, he finally was liquidated, his body being carted away. In the televised version of this image, there's a point at which the camera captures his face, his mouth is open, and as some people noted, he even appeared to be as surprised that the war was finally over as everybody else. Lebanon. Almost by far the most complicated. It's the hardest for me to write about. Here too, a breakdown of the pact between different sects of Christian and different Muslim groups. But it's really not till the effects of the displacement of Palestinian peoples from Jordan after they were driven out to Lebanon that tipped the balance. By 1975, 10% of Lebanon's population was made up of Palestinian refugees, with a very armed presence of the Fatah in Lebanon. Here, the inciting moment was a series of events in mid-1975, Black Sunday being the spark, in April 13th of that year, which is a shooting outside a church, which led to a series also of reprisals, roadblocks, a bus massacre, the killing of a group of Palestinian and Lebanese sympathizing civilians. Here, the prime minister of Lebanon did try to bring calm to prevent the inciting incident from escalating, but the president, Pierre Gemayel, refused to press charges against one of the Christian militiamen, the Phalange, who'd shot a Palestinian in that shootout in front of the church. And that led to an escalation. The Phalange moved out of their strongholds in East Beirut. The Fedayeen fanned out. It led to reprisals, counter-reprisals, until culminating in the Battle of the Hotels by December of that year. For all intents and purposes, by the end of 1975, that inciting incident made the war irreversible. We can talk about more details later. I'm going to be very quick on El Salvador because we've already talked about it. Here, it's almost the most improbable of the wars because the insurgency was extremely weak at the time. A small group of rebels were really not that well armed and prepared for warfare. And it's the killing of the archbishop that really changed things, because it led to a series of vengeance killings from the right, and these are a series of pamphlets that were distributed around the streets to justify the massacres of priests and of by May 1980, so a few months after Romero was killed, the first large-scale massacres of entire villages by the Salvadorian military, culminating in the execution, very famous execution of 4 American nuns by the end of the year. Even here in this case, United States authorities, this is why I mentioned impunity, could not hold the killers of American civilians to account. By 1981, the Civil War is full on. Like Sri Lanka, Lebanon, each of these domains leading to the fracturing of state sovereignty, the guerrillas creating provinces where they have the complete control in Chalatenango and Morazan. 2 quick conclusions. This is the last image. What leads to civil war is a sequence of these stages of brutalization, revenge, impunity, and then the fracturing of state authority. And we can borrow from the literature on social mobilization and social movements to think about how group identities get formed in these kinds of cascading events. And the microanalysis of how they work provide us clues into the mechanisms of escalating violence. What does it mean for world order? Well, I don't think this is a great game story of Cold War powers using these as proxies. I'm not convinced by that. I think it's more ambiguous on whether this is a failed transition to or from democracy, because in all of these cases, they were civilian democratic governments, not on a road to or from democracy. There is a question about what happens to civilian systems whose representative practices become more and more exclusionary, and when the hazards of tipping into militarized politics appears on the horizon. Last conclusion. How do civil wars shape the world? Well, the edge does bear witness to a world transformation, accelerating the decline, the demise of that post-colonial tiers-mondiste nationalist imaginary, triggering a new discourse of terror and security in the imaginations of sovereign power, with security surveillance from counterinsurgency to counter-terror. El Salvador is the bridge from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Sri Lanka and the conflict over Sri Lanka, especially after the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, was very important for the development of Indian security forces. And of course, the fight in Lebanon and the origins of Hezbollah that come out of the South Lebanon changed the regional security system across the Middle East. So it absolutely has a decisive effect there. But at the same time, the spectacle of violence also had effects on global norms of human rights, mediation of peacekeeping, United Nations capacity. In fact, in response to civil wars, you get the birth of global governance. These were the building blocks of that post-1989, post-wall world order. And the contradictions between, let's say, human rights and peace building on the one hand, and surveillance, counterinsurgency, and the war on terror on the other, meant that new forms of inclusion and respect coincide with practices of surveillance and control, both emergent at a global scale. 35 years later, this contradiction is now laid bare in the collision of national securitization versus humanitarian norms now. And this is why Gaza is a crisis of our conscience and of our narrative, and why Sudan is simply completely out of sight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for this very contemporaneous but also sobering view on the problem. We now have a bit of time for questions, and while I ask you to just raise your hand so that I can give you the speech, I wanted to ask you one thing, Jeremy, about when I hear you, and especially this circle of, the steps of brutalization, vengeance, impunity, and then fragmentation of the space. What's interesting here is what is the mechanism that sort of inflates the classic sort of dark circle of, stress and violence, destruction, retaliation that creates again stress, and that spirals up. What creates the fact that it takes such a size? And I was wondering if it's not the fact that there is a polarization effect at the point of vengeance, or at some point in there, that creates two large groups instead of just the people concerned. And so what would be the historical preconditions for something like that to happen? There's one certainly that is a lot of tension and stress so that there's enough latent violence to explode. But there's probably also something as a latent fragmentation that creates so easily this polarization that makes it a global conflict.
Yeah, great questions. I'll be brief because we don't have much time. Just to start with the second query about, let's say, the historical preconditions or the latent fragmentation. I think this is one of the key challenges. Polarized societies don't always go to civil war. In fact, most don't. So you need to, there's an independent set of variables that enter into the equation. There is a literature around what's called around the grievance versus greed forces that lead to a greater fragmentation. And it's the difficulty explaining this is one reason why I think we need events to have their own effect on group identities that create the fragmentation rather than presume that the fragmentation is driving it. This does not mean that there aren't some underlying preconditions. Obviously, in all of these cases, extreme wealth disparity plays an important role, just to name one, and we can talk some more about that. The first question you posed was about polarization, and I'm very interested in how mixed hybrid societies and neighborhoods get unmixed, how the social categories of belligerents at war are the effect and not necessarily the cause of the war itself, right? And group identities, and that's why naming things, telling stories, creating the category of the Black Day or the Black Month become part of the rituals of unmixing and creating enemies when you were once a neighbor. And I think that's where the microanalysis, again, borrowing from social movement literature, really helps us develop more precise causal explanations.
Thank you. Jeremy Stallo.
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed this. And my question might be kind of marginal to your analysis, but I couldn't help but be struck by the role of photographic images, both in your presentation, but also in many ways you've pointed out either directly in some of your comments or in some of the images you showed us how photography itself
Yeah.
is working as an actor in so many of the, I mean, I'm thinking among others of the picture of Che Guevara behind the photograph of the uh, Tamil Tiger leader
Yeah.
and so on. And I'm just wondering, I guess it's a double question. On the one hand, what ways do you think that images are serving some of these functions, either ritually or in other ways, to allow for this modular or this kind of the travel of these different movements and inform sources of inspiration or documentation. But also, I'm wondering how, since so much of the imagery was driving your own presentation,
Yeah.
how you work methodologically with images. If you want to share something about how they inform the way you're doing this work, I'd be very curious.
Thanks, Chip. Should I answer or?
Yes, please. Yeah,
Okay.
yes, please. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you caught that, Jeremy.
And there's Mark. I've seen your hand, Mark. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Actually, I've been doing a lot of work on journalism, reportage, particularly around photography. I could spend the next few hours talking about this and thinking about the photographers who were on the spot. That last image was a Susan Meiselas photograph, for instance. I've been thinking a lot about it. I've been thinking about iconography as part of the making of the narrative. So how the images, and that's why the photograph within the photograph is the photograph of, or there's rather a rendition of a photograph taken of Che, and there's the photograph of Gaddafi as an icon. There are visuals embedded within visuals in the construction of these kinds of identities. And of course, the images become part of the narration itself by these social actors. And so I've been trying to track how photographs work and how they then fan out and become part of a set of, let's say, tools that actors use to convey their narrative to wider new audiences, particularly global ones. We could spend a lot of time talking about it. I'll just mention that the FMLN, which was the main insurgent alliance in El Salvador, had a whole division that worked very closely with journalists who had complicated relationships with the guerrillas to get images of atrocities out into the newspapers, and to the constant annoyance of the Reagan administration, unable to control the narrative because these photographs, like the photograph that you saw of the nuns, was on the front page of the Washington Post and the New York Times. So images play an enormous role these are image wars as much as they're, and again, it's the post-Vietnam moment in, let's say, representational practices. I can spend a lot of time talking about it, the Susan Sontag dilemma, and about visual exhaustion. So my method is to track the circulation of images, the responses to images in the construction of these new practices, and to read the photographs as sources themselves. Most historians are pretty square on this, and they are text-based. It's okay myself. Here I'll be disclosive, and thinking graphically doesn't always come naturally to them, but we can read the images, and that's why I would draw a reader's eye to the shoes, to the images embedded within images, facial expressions, and so on. So reading images instead of using them as passive ornamental devices is really important.
Mark, who directs an organization which tries to end these conflicts.
Yeah.
And prevent. No, thanks, Sadi. Thanks very much, Jeremy. My question, I suppose, is a sort of a mirror in a different way to what Jeremy just asked, and I just wonder to what extent, as part of your overall theory or thinking at this stage, you're taking into account what I could just broadly call the history of bad ideas that take hold. Super liberal ideas, fetishization of violence, universities and scientists that excuse atrocities, romanticization of of killers, very bad theories of just cause and just war. I mean, these things can take hold in countries and they can take hold globally, and they often begin in academies.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, I mean, is that a small factor? But when I think about the places that don't go to enter in civil wars, I'd be surprised if those I would expect there to be a higher propensity to embrace really bad liberal violence excusing ideas in places that do go into civil war versus places that don't. But again, it's just the armchair theory, but I'm just curious, the history of bad ideas. What does,
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to think about this, Mark. It's a great question. There are lots of bad ideas in circulation in wars, and particularly especially in these kinds of contests, including bad ideas as nationalist fables that justify mass atrocities against others. I could give you lots of examples of where ideas and narratives are at stake in justifying the atrocities. We just saw in the case of Archbishop Romero, there are rival Catholic senses of purpose between a liberation theology progressive wing, which Archbishop Romero comes very late to in his life, it's worth saying, versus a phalangist Maronite. That's why the phalange from El Salvador to the phalange in Lebanon, they are a mutual identification about this anti-communist, nationalist, far-right Catholic movement. So there are many. I think it's worth saying at the same time, Mark, that the bad idea factories are themselves become targets, as well as good idea factories are targets in civil wars, and universities are at the epicenter. So the American University of Beirut, to give you an example, becomes explicitly a target during the Lebanese Civil War. The two main universities in El Salvador, the same. In fact, in 1989, the rector of the Central American University is assassinated, and that's actually the opposite of the inciting moment. That's the moment that triggers the beginnings of active UN mediation. So universities become places where, because the ideas matter a great deal. I'll kind of just end there.
Lavinia, short answer to a short question.
Yeah.
I will be very short. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I work on scarcity, so I couldn't help wondering when you mentioned the question of natural resources, how that plays out in your story, because we think about the role of natural resources, of the control of natural resources in interstate wars. But as an early modernist, I kept wondering about famines, hunger, the moral economy, of bread and natural resources and crops in the civilizing societies from within. So I was wondering whether you will tackle this question, or if that was key in any of your case studies. Thank you.
That's great, Lavinia, and we'll just have to talk about it some more, but it's just two quick thoughts on it. Yes, it's very important. First, and back to Sadi's point about what are the preconditions for this kind of violence, is the extreme maldistribution of resources, particularly around land in all three societies. The Shia population is to a very large extent landless, and part of their identification as they begin to mobilize, and this is the precursor to Hezbollah, is around landlessness. To be discussed when we have lunch next week. So resources play an important role. They also play an extremely important role in driving the violence. You can only get the durability of these wars. These are long, very brutal wars, in part because the belligerents get access to their own resources to perpetuate them. One reason why we know civil war, the difficulty ratcheting back civil wars, is when belligerents have the independent access to the means to reproduce violence. And that means resources. So figuring that out, the type of warfare and resource access is an important clue to the durability of the conflicts.
Thank you again, Jeremy. We'll have to stop now, but we will continue at lunch, and I encourage our audience to also read your papers.